There is no more glaring distortion in the history learned by generations of Americans in textbooks, in schools, in the popular culture, than in the story of Christopher Columbus. But what is missing from that story is that when he landed in Bahamas Islands, Columbus and his men, greeted by peaceful and generous natives, set out on a ruthless quest for gold that led to enslavement, misery, and death for that population. He kidnapped and enslaved hundreds of Arawaks, compelling them to work in the mines under terrible conditions in the quest for gold. It was the start of European conquest of the Western Hemisphere.
I just want to say that I highly anticipate that we're going to hear some folks who speak very broadly about the Italian community. And I just want to upfront here identify myself as, as a descendant of Italian immigrants, and consider myself an Italian American. And that I don't think that it's not possible. I'll put it that way. It's not possible that we will hear from anybody here today who can speak on behalf of the Italian or the Italian American community as any sort of monolith. It involves a lot of variety of folks, as in any collective identification. So we'll just leave it at that for now.
That in the 1900s, there was only 250,000 Native Americans left on this continent, that we had been virtually almost wiped out, which was basically the idea of it. But we're still here. I'm still here. Our history is still here. It's important that this resolution gets passed so that we are not forgotten. The indigenous people of this continent are not forgotten. We have a rich history. We have a history that has a darkness to it. And it's important that people know this, that students know this. This kind of history, what is about our people, is not written in textbooks. Our children are not learning this because there's not enough information out there, because people think that we're forgotten or that we're portrayed in Hollywood, as being a certain type of stereotypical Indian. We're not. We're human beings too.
We saw on 2 different instances signs saying we're going to be closed on Columbus Day to celebrate the discovery of America, which is just, historically, that's just not true. And that's, I think, another continued myth and that isn't true, that's spread in our schools and spread by our governments by not acknowledging the real history of indigenous people being the folks, the humans that first came to this land. And so I think that I appreciate what I believe was the intent, which is to, in solidarity with the Indigenous Peoples Movement, to rename this day Indigenous Peoples Day. So I'm going to vote no.
As I grew up in public school, I was always taught how amazing Christopher Columbus was, how he discovered the New World. I was told by my teachers that all of the Indians were dead. At the same time, my classmates called me Injun, Redskin, and other insulting terms as they tried to tell me that I was less than them. They thought Native people were extinct, but I knew for a fact that we weren't. I am a living, breathing Native American girl in a very racist world. Today I stand here representing the Sioux Nation and all of the Indigenous people around the world who think they do not have a voice. We should have Indigenous Peoples Day to say we are still here.
I am half Italian and half Irish. Grew up in an Italian household. My great-grandfather, who came here from Italy at 17, is my hero. He worked his tail off to the point where his great-great-grandchildren continue to live in the house that he was able to purchase through his hard work. I am grateful every day for what he was able to do here. I also grew up, he was 10 years old and I lived with him until he died. I also grew up hearing some of the stories about what he faced as an Italian American coming to this country, and including being beaten by Cambridge police officers back then. And I have great respect for and appreciation for all the different immigrant groups that come to this country that on their initial arrival, and sometimes long after their initial arrival, have to face incredible obstacles and racism. But even with that knowledge, and really because of that knowledge, I view changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day really as a cleansing for me as an Italian American, because I do not want Christopher Columbus to be representing my culture. And so I don't look at this as being something that's being taken away. I really view it as, in terms of my Italian perspective, I view it as really making it a day that I can actually be proud of, as opposed to a day that I get off from school for someone who committed, even by those standards, right, some of the worst atrocities and genocide in American history, or in world history. As far as, we heard incredible stories and testimony from Indigenous people about what they have had to experience, not just in their history, but every October 11th, where this country celebrates someone who was, in many ways, the major or the first person to really start the genocide that took place in this part of the world. So I fully support this. I think it's something that we should do. I think it's the least we can do. And as someone who is very proud of his Italian culture and his Italian family, I hope others will view this as us cleaning up our own house a little bit and doing what's right here.
I'm standing here before you as a mother, as a grandmother, as a human being, that I'm asking for you for the reconciliation and the justice and the healing for our people. And we talk about Columbus Day coming and being here from 500 years ago and the terrorization that began and the trauma. But what I want to bring to you and let you know that this still exists today for our children in our rooms, in our classrooms. My son in kindergarten entered through those doors into the public school system with his wearing his hair long and strong and proud. On Columbus Day that night, he came home and at our dinner table looked at me and said, "Mom, I'm not Indian." And that broke my heart, because I knew whatever was said and whatever was done broke his heart that day.
Thank you.
And I'm just pleading that this needs to be changed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next.
Point I made at the outset was, unfortunately, over time, somehow Columbus has been conflated with Italian heritage, and they're not the same thing. And so this is the point that we're making. Now, again, that's as we've talked before. Again, that could be a separate issue if someone wants to introduce a bill that speaks to Italian American heritage. I have no problem with that. But again, to right or wrong of history, right? Again, I think there are people who decide to celebrate Columbus Day as if it were Italian American Heritage Day, which it's not. At the same time, as we talk about the struggles that we have in this country, specifically, as you mentioned, the MLK holiday, again, which is the converse of someone like Columbus, right? Someone who actually died in the freedom struggle for peoples who have been less than recognized and dehumanized. They're not even in the same league. But again, I think if there's a conversation around Italian American heritage, I think that's another conversation that we should have. But clearly, as far as Indigenous Peoples Day, the purpose is specifically to honor the indigenous peoples of this land who have never been honored.
I'm here to take a stand so that my daughter Brianna and my son Negosis are able to grow up in a city where they feel safe, respected, and honored. Replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day in the city of Minneapolis would show my children that it's never too late for healing and reconciliation to occur between communities. I remember growing up on the south side of Minneapolis as a young girl and learning about this man who discovered the land where I was taught my ancestors had always lived. It wasn't later until I reached high school when I learned what this man really did and what this moment in history means to my people. I don't have to recount the unspeakable atrocities that took place, because as Indigenous people, we carry them with us every single day. But the city of Minneapolis has an opportunity through this vote to show its Indigenous residents that they hold the same dignity and values as all others living in the city by replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day.
I think the acknowledgement of Indigenous People Day, it brings up a hard topic. And a lot of times hard topics are where we find some sort of resolution. Those hard conversations are needing to be had more and more nowadays, I believe, with the climate that we have in our country. And this is an opportunity to lay it all out. I think to ignore or to omit just for ease of comfort is what led us to the majority of the country celebrating Columbus Day and not Indigenous People Day.
American Indian, First Nations, Native Hawaiian, Alaskan Native, Aboriginal, Indigena, Indigenous. Before the arrival of Columbus, the Akmel Atham and the Peepash people cared for this land that we currently stand on. It took me 21 years to figure that out. And how I found out was not through public Phoenix elementary school education, but within the ASU American Indian population. When a majority does not grow up understanding that 22 federally recognized tribes live in Arizona, there's a feeling of invisibility within the American Indian populations. When people say, "I thought your kind was extinct," that contributes to the feeling of invisibility. That, in the context of only Arizona State University, contributes to the statistics of dropout rates within American Indian populations. That, in the context of our Phoenix society, affects the allocations in healthcare, structures of Arizona laws, opinions of natural resources, and experiences of our police forces, and leaves our youth to wonder, are they worth recognizing? However, in this day and age, our American Indian youth do not want to be invisible anymore. They want to correct history. They want to protect our resources. They want to protect everyone. Indigenous Peoples Day for the City of Phoenix initiates the much-needed conversations within our schools, in our businesses, and in our society that teaches people about Indigenous perspectives, not just American Indians, but people from all backgrounds. With this day, I, as a citizen of Phoenix, will gain the confidence in my city's claim to inclusion. And to the Phoenix community the community of Phoenix, they will gain many ancient perspectives. I am just a vessel for all those who have came before me, and I hold it my responsibility to share the knowledge that my ancestors have granted me. And with that, I want to say that this is not the end-all solution to all the difficulties that are found within the modern-day American Indian experience. I will say this is a much-needed start, and I thank you for listening to my perspective, and I urge you to vote yes to Indigenous Peoples Day.
I have similarly gotten some emails because for some folks, Columbus Day has been translated into a special day for Italian Americans. But I want to make it very clear that I have no interest in any way insulting our Italian American community, and I don't think it should be viewed in that light. What I do care about, however, we have precious few opportunities to recognize Native Americans who suffered so horrifically in our country, and I would like to take this day and have this day converted to recognition of them. And so I will vote for this today. Thank you.
I will take a few questions, and I'm going to address that first one right away. The question was about Italian Americans. I think Italian Americans have a rich history in the city of Boston and certainly in our nation. We should celebrate all cultures. And I want to remind everyone here, justice is not a zero-sum game. We can lift up the experiences of Indigenous peoples, and we can also respect Italian Americans.
Columbus was no hero. We've heard countless other speakers go into more detail about that. He did not discover us. As Rick Eichstead mentioned earlier, thousands of Indigenous people lived in this area for thousands of years, and they've lived here since time immemorial. This resolution would go a long way in righting a wrong And I'm asking the City Council to be on the right side of history and approve this resolution. Thank you.
I've heard everybody talk about, us as adults, and we understand the ideas with Columbus Day and what he stood for, and that brings oppression, and I don't want my children oppressed anymore. We need to consider, I don't want them marginalized or their history marginalized. I want them celebrated. I want them to have a place and an identity within their community and within their public schools. So I think that that's something to consider, and I just want to thank you for allowing me to speak. I think there's a lot of things, positive things that could come out of renaming the day and giving our children a place in the community, within their communities at schools. So thank you for allowing me to talk, Lemna.
And when it was time for him to leave, the man asked him if he was going to print the truth. And the reporter responded, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And I think that's what we've done in our school system for the last 100 and something years, is we've printed the legend and adopted it. Christopher Columbus discovered America. And that's been indoctrinated into generations of our children. One of the things that I find interesting about this debate, and a comment by Councilman Fagan about, well, this all happened 500 and something years ago, and we're trying to judge someone by standards of today. Well, that doesn't fly. In point of fact, Christopher Columbus was the captain of the ship. He was responsible for the behavior of his men. Christopher Columbus was the one who invented slave trade out of the Caribbean era. Christopher Columbus was the person who called for and allowed the mutilation of native people where he was governing. Christopher Columbus, as a governor of the region, was called back to Spain and imprisoned for his behavior, both towards the native people and towards the other people who were living in his colonies. So in his own records and in his own words and by his own behavior 500 and something years ago, we can judge him today, and we can say that behavior was unacceptable. It was unacceptable then, and it's unacceptable now. And so why is it that we are celebrating the man who never once set foot on the North American continent as the person who discovered America?
Having grown up in the public school system here, I learned about my own culture through a lens that began when Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. There's this romantic idea that we didn't exist until he found us. This idea that we didn't exist and that we were wiped out is incorrect. I'm a mother of two here, and I've been able to go into my children's classes and to teach about our culture from our point of view, a point of view that the teachers aren't necessarily able to. Tonight, you have the opportunity to celebrate and acknowledge the people who were here pre-contact, and to change a day that celebrates something ugly. And I really hope that this is something that you all consider, that when we were wiped out of history from our history books, yet we're here, it's almost like we're seen as ghosts. When we have to continually fight for our identity, it's disheartening.
And that's when we talk about Indigenous Day. We're talking about identifying the people who are from here. I didn't come from somewhere else. My ancestors here. I'm from Situnanga, which is Encino. This is my ancestors' lands. I have nowhere to go. This is where I'm from. I'm here to look at it. I know it's painful. I know it's hard as Italian people. Your contribution needs to be acknowledged as well. And I know it's emotional, but think about it. When these people came, they were emotional as their lives changed. Thank you.
The City of Minneapolis has the opportunity to continue to show their leadership on racial equity by becoming the first city in the state of Minnesota to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. The common argument from those outside of this community is that there are more important issues for the city to dedicate their time to, that this isn't a big deal. And they're right, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal if you never sat in a classroom as a child and been teased, taunted, or tormented about Columbus Day. It's not a big deal if you've never shed a tear reflecting about Indigenous relatives and ancestors who faced murder, torture, and rape that resulted from this man in this moment in history. It's not a big deal if this issue isn't one that inflicts trauma and pain on those who you love most in the world. But if you or someone you love has had to endure any one of those things, it's a pretty damn big deal. If it's important for the city of Minneapolis to have all of its residents feel respected, dignified, and valued, this is an important step in working towards healing the pain and hurt that is associated with this day and the Indigenous people who call this region home.
These are very real wounds. We have a long history of celebrating genocide in the guise of pretty little packages like Christopher Columbus discovering the Americas. This was not discovered. There were already people here.
President Stuckert, council members, my name is Todd Eckloff. I'm the minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spokane, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this issue. The most important thing I think our society can do for people who have been treated unjustly is to treat them justly by helping to lift them out of poverty, give them equal access to opportunity and equal treatment under the law. Having said that, I think changing the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, or sports mascots to images and names that are neither racist nor offensive, is a good start at acknowledging the worst genocide and Holocaust in human history, the deaths of nearly 20 million Indigenous peoples from this land and the destruction of their civilization. There can remain no rational argument for continuing to slap the faces, to use a phrase, of their descendants by honoring the names of those who have perpetrated some of the worst atrocities in human history. So I urge you to please pass this resolution and give us Indigenous Peoples Day here in Spokane. Thank you.
Shach Pachwai, Iminai Moma, Inash Wanasho Wishkam Shalela Kupashtan Wiki, Shinoa Pinkham. Good afternoon, my people, my relatives. I'm a graduate of the University of Washington. I majored in communication and American Indian Studies. I also graduated from Roosevelt High School, and I currently live here in Seattle. I want to thank you all for your wonderful words earlier about the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution. I thank you all for your support, and I want to encourage those of us who may be on the fence, but to really think hard about this. First time I heard that I was an Indian from a non-native person was when I was 7 years old. And this was from a child in my own classroom, my own age. And so I echo Mr. Rumley's comments about making sure that House Bill 1495 can be fully implemented in our schools. I did my senior project on House Bill 1495, and it's a very important issue to me as a Native woman living here in this world. I was taught that we live in two worlds, our Native cultural world and the outside world, but I feel like in reality we all live in one world, and we all need to validate our own histories as Indigenous people. Our own logo is named as, Indian chieftain right there. And Indigenous peoples, we tend to be invisibilized and not validated starting at a young age. And I feel like this resolution can help bring us forward into the future. And I just want to encourage your support of that and in our public schools. Thank you.
I just want to thank Supervisor Cohen for introducing this. I think that this is long overdue, despite the fact that I was supporting a one-week continuance. I think that correcting our history and the history of a Native people that were brutally both slaughtered and killed off by disease, who were in this land prior to an Italian explorer coming and quote unquote discovering the land that people had been on for a very long time, is very overdue, and I'm going to be very proud to support this today.
So this marks a great change in our relationship, to be able to come to this legislative body with an idea that has come to fruition, the recognition of Indigenous peoples. And so it is time that we change a myth of history. Columbus didn't discover anything. Columbus brought slavery, he brought colonialism, disease, and the list goes on. But here we have a chance, one of the few chances in history, to right a wrong. And as young people growing up, it was always kind of a contradiction we had to live with, that somehow Columbus discovered America when we knew there was, even here in the continental United States, well over 12 million Indigenous people that were already here. We too, as Indigenous peoples, have a creation story to tell. We too have a language, a culture, a government that governs our people. This is the beginning of the recognition of those contributions to the United States, and indeed here to Minneapolis, where the City Council has previously recognized the contributions to the work of, I see one of our great friends, Chris Martonupa, who talked about truth-telling, because he comes from the great Dakota peoples, who in December of 1862 suffered from one of the largest mass hangings in the history of the world, 80 miles south of here. And this gives us a chance to tell the story, to teach the truth. And so we join in unity with Indigenous peoples all over the world. United Nations passed on September 13th, 2007, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a human rights foundation. And so we congratulate the City Council, the Mayor, for taking this step in the recognition of Indigenous peoples and the recognition of human rights and the recognition of a wrongful statement of history.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, the city recognizes so many different individuals, so many different groups. This is the first time we recognize those that were here first and those that have contributed so much to our society. For those of us that grew up here, it's just part of our culture. I mean, it was ingrained in us when we were children, the contributions the Native Americans, those that were here first, the Indigenous, gave. I mean, if you look at our water systems, if you look at our architecture, you look at many of the things around us today, you start to see the influence and the culture and the benefit that the Native Americans have had in our society. I'm going to be supporting this full-heartedly. I think it's great. I think it's about time. And Mayor and Councilman Gallego, I want to thank you. I don't know who else was involved in it up here, but thanks for bringing this forward. I think it's important for us to do that. But more importantly, it's important for us to remember, to acknowledge our history. It's okay to do that, but it is something that I think it's a thing to celebrate. I don't see anything negative in this. I don't hope that it isn't. It's something that's positive going forward, and it's an acknowledgement of all the work that people have done in this community and before us, and that we still see the influence today. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Other council members? Any other comments? Councilman Valenzuela, you have a comment?
Yeah, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I agree with Sal DeCiccio. This is 100% positive. This is America at its best here. It doesn't take away from anything else, and frankly, this is American history. And I will be celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day for what it's worth. Personally, my family, my household, I think it's incredibly important, not just to remember, but to celebrate.
Bartolome de las Casas writes, on one occasion when we went to claim 10 leagues of a big settlement, and I feel like I should give a gigantic trigger warning before finishing this. This is not easy to read or to hear, much less to experience. Along with the food and maintenance, we were welcomed with a bounteous quantity of fish and bread and cooked victuals. The Indians generously gave us all they could. Then suddenly, without cause and without warning, and in my presence, the devil inhabited the Christians and spurred them to attack the Indians, men, women, and children who were sitting there before us. In the massacre that followed, the Spaniards put to the sword more than 3,000 souls. I saw such terrible cruelties done there as I had never before thought to see. Afterward, when all of the Indians of this island were subjected to servitude and the same ruin had befallen there as on the island Hispaniola, the survivors began to flee to the mountains or in despair to hang themselves. And there were husbands and wives who hanged themselves together with their children because the cruelties perpetrated by one very great Spaniard whom I knew were so horrifying. Columbus Day perpetuates this glaring distortion of our history, and genocide makes me angry. Being lied to makes me angry. We all deserve to acknowledge the hard truth of our history. Thank you.
You know, when you think about it, we don't really have power over history, but history has some power over us. History shapes the watercourse that our lives are lived in. And I think there's some things we can do in light of that history. We can remember, and we can repair, and we can respect. Remembering is important, and it's important that we understand history, and it's actually one of my favorite subjects. And one of the things that I've been trying to do to better educate myself about the true history of this country is read some of the great books that have been published over the last few years about our Native American history. My current read, I just flew back from visiting my son yesterday. I'm reading The Heart of Everything That Is, the amazing story about Red Cloud, the leader of the Sioux, during the huge conflicts of the 1860s. Empire of the Summer Moon, about Quanah Parker, the great leader of the Comanche. I think it's incumbent on each of us, regardless of our cultural history, to try to understand the history of our neighbors, our native neighbors, our immigrants who come here from so many other countries. So it's a responsibility of citizenship, I think, to remember and to learn. And I hope we all do that today and not just today. The second thing we can do is repair, because there are still injustices and problems that flow from that history.
Since I was a little girl, I knew that I was treated differently than other little girls because I am Native American, and there's not that many people that are proud to say that. And like even in school, I've never really been taught about the genocide of Native Americans. I've always had to go out of my way to actually learn about it and the whole truth about it. And I just want this to be a forward step of opening like an actual conversation about what actually happened. So I thank you for your consideration for this.
You know, I've personally been challenged, and it can be uncomfortable to consider change. And I hope that the Spokane residents and those who are watching at home tonight are listening to all the stories that were shared, including the stories of Italian Americans, and are honoring each other's stories. And I'm referring to the professor from Gonzaga telling his story about how his family came to the United States and struggled. And I hope that we're all understanding that we all have contributions and experiences here to share in Spokane. I've heard several people say this evening, well, couldn't we choose a different day to celebrate Indigenous peoples? And before tonight's meeting, I wanted to be sure that our local tribes were supportive of a particular day. And tonight's resolution does point out, and I don't know if everyone's had a chance to read it, but in 2011, the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, representing 59 tribes from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Northern California, Western Montana, and some Alaskan tribes, they passed a resolution to change Columbus Day, the second Monday of October, to Indigenous Peoples Day. So many tribes came together, and I'm sure took a long time to discuss this issue, and they have come before us and asked us to consider the second Monday of October. So I want to honor the request to name the second Monday as Indigenous Peoples Day here in the city of Spokane.
Due to historical oppression, our people still struggle. It hurts us to hear about Columbus Day and parades and statues honoring somebody who was responsible for Indigenous genocide, thousands upon thousands of murders. It doesn't help for our children to have to hear this man honored in public school and see parades on his holiday. It feels like people don't care what has happened historically and still happens to Indigenous people now. I'm here with my 3-week-old baby Waya, Wolf, Adenedi Amashelu, gift of water and corn. And I don't want my child growing up in a place that celebrates somebody who was responsible for their ancestors and our Indigenous relatives' genocide, and celebrating a person who trafficked Indigenous children like themselves. Changing the name of the day to Indigenous Peoples Day recognizes the harm symbolically that was done by Columbus. There's nothing related to Italian Americans that means that Italian Heritage Day needs to be on that specific day. Some of our Native community members also have Italian heritage, and we support celebrating Italian heritage on a different day. If it really has nothing to do with Columbus, there shouldn't be a problem choosing a different significant day for that holiday. Indigenous and Native peoples are still on a day-to-day basis trying to convince people that we still exist. We support a bill that changes Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and we believe that the time is now to join with other cities, counties, and states who have led the way in doing this. Shki, thank you.
Obviously, my last name's Italian. I've said this before, and I too heard stories. I was almost Salvatore Rocco Jr., but my mother, who's I thought was English and Dutch, turns out she was also Cherokee, which I didn't find out until I was in 8th grade. The truth is the truth, and I totally support this effort. And I have no confusion, like the Vice Mayor, no confusion on what is right in this issue. My mother told me that we were she was part Cherokee, therefore me, and was a little embarrassed about it when she said when she grew up, nobody talked about it. And I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And I have since read a lot about what happened to the Cherokee and what happened to every indigenous group that Europe confronted around the world. And we have a way to go to make up for that, and this is one small step. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
We are happy that we're at least to a point where we can acknowledge that calling it Columbus Day was completely wrong.
My family in the south of Italy still owns and lives in the same house that my great-grandfather lived in, and that his father and his father and his father lived in. That I remain part of a family that's very rooted in Italy, and they grew out of the Italian immigrant community. And so I just want that when I vote in support of this bill, for it to be real clear where I'm coming from. That's where I come from, and still, you know, when the conversation of Black Lives Matter became a more common kind of dinner table kind of conversation across the United States some years ago, and in a lot of cases, particularly in white households for the first time in history. You know, I come from a family where people, some people at that table would say, well, whoa, let's not forget about how oppressed the Italians were. And I had to have some real deep conversations about the difference between slavery and genocide and a system that eventually indoctrinated Italians into whiteness. And so I just wanted to be real clear that that's exactly where I'm coming from when I vote in support of this bill.
I struggle with explaining to my nieces, my nephews, my younger siblings, even my peers, the American disillusion of Christopher Columbus. In academia, as well as the real world, it is important to understand how counterintuitive it is for us as a community to continue a practiced tradition of recognizing and glorifying a child molesting, serial rapist, and murderer as a celebrated historical figure.
I am a mother of children, and so I'm thinking this is not a legacy I want any part of, is the Columbus legacy. Having Columbus being the one who honors Italians is the equivalent of having a holiday for the Borgias, as far as I'm concerned. So I think it's time to move on to a healing, truthful holiday and remove the Columbus Day, and that is the right thing to do for our children and their children's children, for a real legacy that we can build a future on. Thank you.
You know, I didn't disagree when Manny spoke about recognizing, what Italian Americans, went through. I grew up with those stories. I grew up with the stories of my great-grandfather, how he was beaten regularly by Cambridge police officers. But we don't get to know that history by Columbus Day. What should those celebrations be, right? There are also great opportunities to focus on things. So instead of just coming up here and eating Italian food or eating Irish food or, whatever, and listening to music, maybe we need to really think about having speakers that also talk about the difficulties that these groups went through. And I think those are great opportunities, but you don't do that at the expense of somebody else.
I just want to personally say, I don't think it's weak for us to revisit our history. I actually think it's strong to revisit our history, and I think when we're strong enough to do that, you see ugliness that it's important to face head on, and you also see history that might have been forgotten or suppressed that's very worthy of celebration.
And I support this movement fully because it is part of the healing process. In Undoing Racism, we talk a lot about white superiority and what it has done to our nation, and why even white people need to heal from racism. If people don't understand what racism is, everything else will mess you up. It'll fool you. It'll keep you rotten to the core, in a sense. This whole belief that Columbus was a hero has a lot of darkness to it. We have to take this sense of Columbus and shake it off its center in order that we all heal. Because we can't keep believing in heroes that are dark in this sense, because then that we buy into the evil, then we become the evil. We are part of it. So we have to look and think about what we want done. Do we want our grandchildren to be raised in that same darkness, belief in the darkness, or do we want to move towards healing? And I know that it can't be just natives that want to decolonize and look at the brutality of colonization, but it should be white people too that look at what it has done to your hearts and spirits and your souls, because it shouldn't have to be this way that you stay in the dark.
This is a resolution, Ms. Murray, so it's not an ordinance. All who still wish to celebrate Columbus Day are welcome to do so, and you have the text right in front of you if you want to visit that directly.
Teachers take a cue from you as political leaders. When it's Columbus Day in Welpinett, Washington, I know that since I've been in grade school, we teach about Columbus and his discovery of America. We can name the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. We all can. But who can name the 3 bands of the Spokane Tribe of Indians? Not only the upper, the middle, and the lower, but our traditional names. Swinjomene, the pink-cheeked people named after the salmon. We were so in touch with our river and our natural resources. And what we do as a tribe today, we fight for water quality. And what we do as a tribe benefits everybody. If we have clean water, that protects the aquifer that serves the city of Spokane. I'm a taxpayer. I live in Meade, Washington. I have 3 Spokane Indian children that attend schools here in the city of Spokane. And I want them to be proud of their city. I, as a professor at Eastern Washington University, I'm forced to teach what's in the books. So I teach about manifest destiny, I teach the law, and I teach what's in our books. And it matters what you as leaders decide today. We are Indigenous people, and we lived here, and we thrive here today. We're teachers, we're young children, and there were popes and kings dividing up this country for spices and for gold. And that's not something we honor as a local people. So I urge you to consider the resolution.
I would be happy to support a motion or resolution to acknowledge and thank for the Italian-American contributions to America. I don't think Christopher Columbus is a good representation of those values. And I always loved him growing up because I shared a name with him. But we were taught growing up that this is a guy who came to America, it was actually the Bahamas, to kind of take over the land, to discover it, the savages that were there, and kind of make sure that they were colonized and were doing the right thing. And we now know that there were millions of people living in the United States that didn't need to be discovered by Christopher Columbus. And not only did they not need to be discovered, the conditions in which Christopher Columbus and his ilk treated them would put them in jail or the death penalty today. So I'm happy that we're acknowledging the millions of people that didn't need to be discovered, that were always here, and be happy to support a resolution on behalf of Italian Americans altogether. But I think history tells us that Christopher Columbus was not a good representation of the kind of people we'd want to value and appreciate.
And one of my goals as the city archaeologist has always been to make people aware that Native people are not just in the past. We're still here. We are thriving cultures that are still very much connected to these places, to places like Garden of the Gods, Pikes Peak, all the way out to Corral Bluffs. The region in general has a really deep history for us. We still very much care about it. Here, we're still stewards of these places, and hopefully will help people to also be good stewards of these places.
Into it, and one of the things that I find interesting is that the first peoples to really help with forest management, and we're talking about this quite a bit right now, were the Indigenous people. They were the ones doing prescribed burns. They were taking care of the trees. I don't know if people hike and see these Ute culture trees in the area where they very carefully use the tree in a productive way, but to keep it healthy. And so many things that we need to be thankful for in terms of why we love living here and what we all take for granted. So.
And, I come to this conversation as a Jewish American whose family, part of my family was annihilated in the Holocaust. Part of my family escaped to the United States, also faced anti-Semitism here, but also were able to assimilate into whiteness. And so, I think about sort of my own sort of weird way into this conversation, which is that I think Jews and Italians both have experienced some horrors within this country. But I think in both cases, at least in the United States, it pales in comparison to what was done to Native American folks, Indigenous folks, and certainly Black folks.
It is quite unfortunate. Before coming and sitting around this council, I was a teacher in high school, and to see the lack of knowledge of what the history in our country really looks like is very disheartening. I think that it speaks volumes to a lot of the issues that we have in this country, in this city today. The fight for equality, the fight for equity, the fight for just about all that we see began with Indigenous people.
A few weeks ago, almost all of us were at the grand opening of
the Holocaust Museum here in the city of Dallas. And what I took away from that was the word upstander. And Mr. Mayor, you made a really big comment about that during our meeting about being an upstander. And that didn't just include that community, it includes all communities to be an upstander. We heard from an amazing woman from Rwanda who very recently dealt with genocide and is living here in our city. And I don't think there was a single person in the room that didn't have tears in their eyes, from our mayor to our governor to every council member, elected official, and all the attendees. And for that, I'm going to be an upstander, and I'm going to stand with the Indigenous folks today. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And I do this because our history books erase such history. History is told through the eyes of the victor. And when you look at history, when you study history, when someone talks about the history of Denver, it always begins with the gold rush and how it was settled by settlers and folks heading west looking for gold along the confluence of the Platte and Cherry Creek. And I was going to say this earlier with the Platte River and the importance of the Platte River and what that means when we honor the Platte River and when we're trying to rehab that Platte River and bring it back to life and not let it be something where we dump things in, but something that we celebrate, is because that very confluence of that Platte River and Cherry Creek is where our city was founded. And it was founded by the Arapaho and Cheyenne people. That's where their seasonal encampments were. That's why it was on the map. But we also know that in the course of history, especially as folks pushed westward, that there had been a forced removal. And I'll read this whereas the seasonal encampments, where the city and county of Denver hereby recognizes the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas and the subsequent forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of Indigenous peoples, communities, and culture, resulting in high poverty rates, disparities in education, health and socioeconomic status.
But I'm also here representing the Human Rights Commission tonight. So one of our main responsibilities is to oppose systematic racism, and in this case specifically the long-standing traditions and icons that the U.S. has considered honorable. These icons established a culture of dominance over the first peoples of this land and are named in history books through sanitized versions as courageous explorers. Tonight you will be considering the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution. This is a proactive and symbolic resolution. In other parts of the country, this type of effort deliberately replaces Columbus Day with the celebration of the first peoples of this continent.
I am here to speak on embracing Indigenous Peoples Day. I find it very important. From my own experiences growing up in kindergarten, coming home with a paper headdress on and being taught what a beautiful uniting of cultures it was for natives in Columbus and pioneers. And going home to realize that that wasn't true and seeing my family so upset with a paper headdress on my head. When my little sister went to kindergarten, I worried about how her being Native would affect her in school as well. And I remember her coming home in tears one day saying that she was outcasted from being able to play with the other kids. She was told that her skin was too dark. In middle school, I had rocks thrown at my head on a daily basis on my way to school. I was told that my hair was too long and that I needed to wash my skin because it was too dark. I was called prairie nigger on a daily basis to school. I hated going to school. When I tried to bring this up to school counselors, I was told to stop whining. I was taught on a regular basis that either we didn't exist or that things were much nicer and blending of cultures than what really happened. To this day, I I still meet people on a regular basis that have no idea the truth about Columbus. I don't think anyone purposely embraces the idea of a racist, a rapist, a man tried committing genocide. In reviewing all this and remembering how things are, how things have been, I think it's very important to not only not celebrate Columbus, but to embrace Indigenous people and to state as a community that we are not okay with that history and that the true history is deserving of respect. I think it would be far less likely for these things to continue or to worry about them continuing if we took a proactive approach instead of avoidance. I think it's very, very important for the community to come together and for Native people to see that the community does not accept this idea.
I just couldn't let it pass without expressing my gratitude for everybody who's worked on this. I think we all have a pretty personal story about discovering the history of our country. I think we all want a country that we can be proud of and not ashamed of. And I think we've personally had to come to terms with that in our lifetimes. And I see this as a very small piece of a much larger healing that has to happen in our country so that we can be whole again and we can move on as one. And this is a great day for me. And I also...
All my life, I've been taught about Christopher Columbus and how great of a man he was. And I didn't know I was Native American until I was a freshman in high school, actually. And being taught about everything that they say about Christopher Columbus, they only give a short definition and they glorify everything he did. In preparing for this, for being here, I did a little research and I was truly, my jaw dropped when I was reading everything that he did. He enslaved so many people, he killed so many people. People would rather kill themselves and their children than be enslaved by him because he was so cruel.
And as your representative to the Human Rights Commission, it really is my pleasure and my privilege to bring this recommended motion to the Council. They, as was mentioned, passed it unanimously. And some folks might say, why are we messing around with traditions? Why is this the role of the City Council? But I think every once in a while, we as the representatives of the city should pause and talk about what traditions we should be proud of, what traditions reflect our values, and what we as a community want to celebrate. And I think in this instance, it's important that our values and what we are proud of should be reflected in the things that we do. And right now, I don't think if you do even a little bit of searching on the internet, Columbus is the person you want to be celebrating. But I do think the Indigenous people of our area and our country are very much the kind of people that we are proud of, should celebrate, and do reflect the values that this community holds.
One of my roles is a mental health therapist. As a therapist, I witness firsthand how false messages, imagery, and information negatively impacts our community. It is absolutely necessary that I advocate on behalf of my community where there is an alarming rate of suicide, substance use, intimate partner violence, health disparities, and repeated trauma. I have the responsibility to ensure the emotional, psychological, and physical well-being of my clients and my community. Understand that I have a lived experience of everything I've just shared with you. As a student, I learned and did the research. As a therapist, I worked tirelessly to create space to heal many generations of trauma.
Thank you.
Good evening. You're right, Jim. The word genocide is negative. But that's nothing, that is a tiny word compared to what actually happened. I would like to refer you to two studies. American Holocaust by Dr. David E. Stannard, Stannard. They did the numbers, and what I did was I took the median of each study. Then I took the average of the two medians. And the number that came up is 79.5 million Indigenous people were slaughtered by the white settler colonists. Now that's pretty negative. But guess what, Jim? Sometimes the truth is just negative. There's nothing positive about how we have treated the indigenous people. I mean, nothing.
I think in order for us to heal and move forward, you have to acknowledge what first was. My grandfather was a carpenter, and he talked about that in building houses. If you don't acknowledge what is there and address what is there, then whatever you build on top of that isn't going to last. And so I think by having certain words in this document, we acknowledge what is. We acknowledge what is. But I also think in this document, we acknowledge what we aspire to be. Okay? It's an aspiration of who we are as a city and where we plan on going. And I would ask everybody in the community to make sure that we on council remember what it is that we aspire to be. This council will not always be this council, and definitely moving forward, councils will change. But we do have this document here, and so I ask all of us to just remind council from time to time what it is that we said we were aspiring to be.
I'm voting to replace, okay? I'm voting to replace. Because, you know, when I was growing up, my grandfather told me, son, if you know better, do better. And for us to sit here and try to celebrate, you know, all the negative things that this figure has done to people in this country and other countries, and we're going to celebrate it. I have a problem with that. And so my vote, when I cast today, will be to replace. And I've never in my life, like Councilmember Travis said about the books and what we learned in school, never in my life heard it as Italian American Day. All about Christopher Columbus, who founded America, which is a lie. A bold-faced lie. For us to sit here and try to perpetrate and allow the public to think something different is a problem for me. So my vote, yes, it is to replace, because we need to stop this.
And I'm a Chickasaw tribal citizen and director of the American Indian Studies Center at UCLA. I come before you as a scholar of human rights and justice processes in order to say that today you hold in your hands the opportunity to carry out an act of restorative justice. Eliminating Columbus Day as a city holiday is an acknowledgement of both the historical falsehoods that have been ideologically propagated against Indigenous peoples and the ongoing harm that the celebration of this day represents for our peoples today. In the creation of Indigenous Peoples Day as a holiday in this city on the second Monday of October is an act of restorative justice in the sense that it restores a truth directly and facilitates a process of mutual forgiveness.
I just Googled Columbus Day. It is a U.S. holiday that commemorates the landing of Christopher Columbus in the Americas on 1492. My husband is Italian American. I just asked him, Matt, have you ever considered Columbus Day to be American Italian Day? He stood in shock because no, he has not. His Nona makes the best manicotti in the world. He is proud of his heritage, and he is not in any way offended by the fact that we would recognize Indigenous Peoples Day. So the fact that we're having this conversation, Mayor, I find to be extremely disturbing, the political theater around this, and simply what we're trying to do is recognize and respect the true history of the United States of America.
It's worth remembering that Christopher Columbus, his conscience was not troubled by the taking and selling of slaves. Today we come here to remember that the long, dark shadow of Christopher Columbus also reached to California. Before 1769, California had a native population of 350,000 people. After 60 or 70 years of colonization, 80,000 Indians had been baptized and 60,000 in the missions had died. 25,000 of those were children under the age of 10.
You know, I mean, he's correct in the sense that Franklin Delano Roosevelt acknowledged Columbus Day back in 1938 or 39 just to get the Italian American vote. But I don't know if Travis just did not attend public session when we had quite a few individuals speaking on behalf of recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day, the atrocities that were made by Columbus. But yet you want to acknowledge that it's not about Italian. It's about Columbus. Christopher Columbus. He's getting credit for discovering America when the Native Americans were here for thousands of years. Let's not forget the atrocities that this man brought to the Americas, and that's what this is about.
I wanted to say that we are not about anti-immigrant or anti-Italian, but not about celebrating a man who caused great harm. Just as it has taken work to obscure Indigenous people, it will take all of us to move forward from past harms. It is not about celebrating one version of history over all others, but addressing how we may come together as communities and recognize our relationship to this place as we build a future. Invisibility has harmed Indigenous communities in material ways. We are the highest population who experience sexual violence, 1 in 3, incarceration, and extreme forms of violence outside our own racial groups. All too often, these statistics are left out of reporting, however, even though on the socioeconomic indicators, American Indian, Alaskan Natives often are at the lower rung.
Thank you.
Stereotypes hurt all our children.
Thank you. Thank you.
This resolution does not aim to erase history or undo injustices, but it is an important step towards accuracy and inclusivity. Officially recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day on the second Monday of October provides a more balanced representation of our cultural and diverse history. I also see this as an opportunity for us to raise awareness, whether in the workplace, in the classrooms, or at home, about the challenges Indigenous peoples in the Americas have faced, but also acknowledging the rich history, cultures, and contributions made before, during, and after the European colonization of the Americas.
A few city council members want us to choose a different day. To make us celebrate on any other day would be a further injustice to a very long line of injustices that have been perpetuated against our people. 2, we have the highest rate of youth suicide. The American Psychological Association has determined that their dehumanizing symbols such as Columbus are part of the cause for that. We must stop that now. Please do what's right. Stand on the right side of history. And we ask you to stand on the side of justice. Thank you.
The historical record is unambiguous in terms of the atrocities that Christopher Columbus himself and his men enacted on the Taino native peoples on the island that they called Hispaniola in 1492, and the 3 subsequent trips back to the West Indies, Central America, South America, setting in process a centuries-long genocide unmatched in breadth and scope anywhere in world history.
Our creation story teaches us that we were created in this landscape. Our brothers and sisters, the salmon, the game, the roots, and the berries offered to provide for us. And as a result, we have a responsibility to help take care of them. This relationship provides a cultural foundation that guides everything that we do. And this cultural foundation is often overshadowed by the tales of Christopher Columbus and of the expansion of the West. These events forever changed our communities, our families, and the resources that we rely on. The creation of Indigenous Peoples Day would be an important first step in broadening our cultural education for Portland citizens. It provides an important platform to educate those around us about the cultures upon which the city of Portland has been built. It allows us to share stories about the sacrifices that have been made in the name of development and highlights the struggles for a cultural way of life that defines our pasts and our future generations. This is a great time to honor the culture and sacrifices of our ancestors that opened this landscape for everyone. It's time to share the complete history of Portland, and the creation of an Indigenous Peoples Day is one step in doing that. Thank you so much.
And it was in part the story of my great-grandparents, Paulo and Elisabetta Constantino, who came here over 100 years ago from Popoli, Italy. My great-grandfather, Paulo, came here in 1895. They married in 1895. He came here in 1900. He got a job here building a dam, the Wachusett Dam in my hometown. He sent for his wife and his 2 children a few years later. 3 days before they were to leave, the 2 children died in a fire. My great-grandmother arrived. They had 2 more children. They died of scarlet fever and pneumonia in the work camp in my hometown. They went on and they had 4 more children, 2 of whom served in World War II, serving this country, even against the country that their parents were born in. And one of whom, my grandfather, went on to work his way through Harvard and Harvard Law School as a barber before becoming an elected official and a municipal court judge in my hometown. During the Depression, they took in up to 8 boarders at a time to support themselves. I got a letter today urging us not to do what Mr. O'Farrell is urging, because I ask that you do not take away the American dream of our ancestors and their history. I've thought about my ancestors and their history, and to me, celebrating Columbus Day does not honor their story and their struggle and their history. It insults it and it besmirches it. They came here to build something and not to destroy something. They came here to make life better for their children and not take away something from somebody else's children. And they did that. And I think the best way as an Italian American that I can honor their sacrifice and their heritage is to try to make the world better for my children and for our children. And part of that is trying to make a better world. And part of that is modeling for my son and teaching my son when to apologize, when to admit he's wrong, and when to try to make amends. And this gesture of replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day is a very small step in apologizing and in making amends. And the symbolism of Indigenous Peoples Day replacing Columbus Day is an apt symbol for a culture of genocide that came and replaced an entire people. It's been said by a few today that the act of replacing is somehow divisive. And I thought on that. I thought on that long and hard. And I thought on our history. And I was reminded that the people who marched on Selma were described as divisive. The people who organized the Great Boycotts were described as divisive. The attempts to allow LGBT men and women to serve in the military was described as divisive and disruptive. The young teenager who speaks up against the anti-Semitic uncle at the Thanksgiving table is often described as the one who's being divisive. And often the pursuit of justice feels uncomfortable or feels divisive to those who are not suffering from the lash of the injustice. It was said by one of the speakers today that it's unfair to remove Columbus Day. I want to think on that for a second. Let that word hang in the air for just a moment. How does describing taking away a holiday as unfair, how must that sound to the few surviving descendants of a people who were raped and massacred and almost eliminated from the face of this continent? How must that sound to the victims of one of the greatest injustices and unfairnesses that this country has ever seen? It's important that we acknowledge the context in which this decision is being made. It's a hard one. It genuinely pains me to disagree with Joe, who I love, who I feel genuine kinship with. One of my favorite people in the world. But in the context of what has happened in this country, in the context of where we are as a people, I think it is important to do what Mr. O'Farrell asks. So as the great-grandson of Italian immigrants who's very proud of their sacrifice and their story, and as someone who grew up on land that used to belong to the Nipmuc Indians in Massachusetts, and who represents land that used to belong to the Gabrielino Tongvas here in Los Angeles, and as someone who wants a better world for his son and that generation, I'm supporting Mr. O'Farrell's motion today.
People said, one of the questions, well, when did you start working on this? And I thought for a moment, when did we start working on it? And for some of us who were around at termination, I was 5 years old. We started working on it in 1954 to tell our story, because that's when the government, by a piece of paper and pencil, said, you ain't Indian anymore. And to me, you can't erase history and culture with a piece of paper and pencil, but you can do things like this, the acknowledgement of Native American people. For us, when we come here, we walk in the footsteps of our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years, and that is really important to us. So to have you acknowledge that by naming this day is very great. So for me, this is a very historical, moving day. I've been on our council for 20 years, and our battle to let people know what is going on and tell our story. And we've even gone as far as to create our own curriculum now. And we're working with some of the Portland schools to actually teach our curriculum in the schools. So it's a great thing. I just want to acknowledge all of what you've done. And this is a first step forward. And we just need to keep going in a positive direction, not only for Grand Ronde, but for everybody. So thank you.
And I'll just say I'm fully supportive of declaring Indigenous Peoples Day in the city of Phoenix. I want to say thank you to Carlos and Jeffrey for your leadership and bringing in all the people that testified, particularly those young leaders. We want to make sure you get your phone numbers, because we're going to ask you to serve on many boards and commissions. Once you step up to the plate, we're going to reel you in. We need your leadership for many other issues on behalf of the city of Phoenix. We should do all we can to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day once it's declared a city. I can't wait to go to Indigenous Peoples events and celebrate that incredible history that we're so blessed to have here in the debt of gratitude that we have to the people that were here decades and generations before us, centuries before us. I think that's an awesome thing for the city of Phoenix. And the more we can use our city facilities, including Pueblo Grande Museum, but other facilities, to send that message, that's going to be great.
I just want to say one thing, and that is that I, as a Native woman, look forward to bringing my future children into a world where we no longer celebrate a man who caused a lot of pain to our Native people, but rather an Indigenous Day where we are able to celebrate and embrace who we are as Native people. Thank you.
The second thing that I wanted to mention as someone of Irish descent was we've talked a lot about the experience of the Indigenous people and what they've endured. And my family comes from famine counties, multiples in Ireland, and Indigenous people supplied us with food when other people would not supply us with food. And I tell Irish people that all the time because I want them to understand that out of understanding of suffering, Indigenous people from this area were incredibly generous to us, and that we may be living proof of that. Thank you.
For too many years, we have languished in the history books as the savages, as the people who are in the way. We aren't in the way. We've opened our hearts, our homes, and our lands to strangers. We've fed your ancestors. We've clothed them. We've welcomed them. And we continue to do so today. What you're about to do is momentous. You're reaching out to Native community here, says more to you about you than anything else. That you welcome us here. City Councilman Harrell, I've been at your home and I've dined with your family. I thank you for that. How many more of you are willing to reach out to us and help us work together for change? How many more of you are willing to help support this bill so your children and your grandchildren can learn what we've known all along? We are still here. We still welcome you, and we thank you for welcoming us. Aho.
Years later, as I was working with the Justice Department, one of my best friends was Kalen Free from the Choctaw Nation. And on, quote, Columbus Day in 1992 is the 500th anniversary. So there were these celebrations at the Washington Mall, and Kalen was out there with a group of protesters. And somebody from Australian television came up to her and asked her, why are you protesting? She said, well, we don't celebrate the birthdays or commemorate in any way Ted Bundy or Son of Sam. So Some of us Indigenous peoples don't understand why people are celebrating Columbus.
I'm Shoshone Bannock Nez Yakima. Thank you for the leadership of the city. I'm a leader also. I'm great-grandson of Chief Aramo from the Shoshone Bannock tribe. I was born on the Duck Valley Indian Reservation in 1946. I really commend you on this Indigenous Day project because in school I was raised with a lot of prejudice in the Dalles, Oregon. That hat that was from Johnny's Cafe, only a restaurant were allowed to eat in the Dalles. There were signs in the window saying no dogs or Indians allowed. Walked down the street, white boys would spit on me. I was raised with overt prejudice, you know. So I carried that hurt with me and tried to drown it in Tokay wine. I spent 12 years on the streets. Slept in every doorway underneath every bridge except the Fremont in Portland for 12 years. Now I'm in recovery today. Event to get people off the streets, to give them shelter because I spent 12 years and it's cold out there. It rains a lot, you know. And I've seen a lot of death in my family. My nephew drank himself to death, being on the streets, you know, so I've seen that happen. What we're talking about here is respect.
Thank you, President Burgess. And thank you for the Human Rights Committee for being here and the Native American population and all the supporters. This is part of a larger discussion of how we celebrate our past and how we recognize our past, and particularly since it's come to focus around Christopher Columbus, who, as we know, for many centuries in Europe has been celebrated as a great hero for discovering a new world for the Europeans. But it came at a tremendous cost to those who he found who was inhabiting that world. And we all know he was searching for Asia and gold, and he found neither. But he did discover a new world for the Europeans, and unfortunately he proceeded to enslave the inhabitants there at a tremendous cost. In the course of just 2 years, 125,000 people, half the indigenous population of Haiti, died due to enslavement or mass suicides under the conditions that Columbus had created. Now, much of this information comes to us actually from a young priest, Bartolome, and he recorded what was occurring during that time. And unfortunately, what happens in so many instances, history is written by the victors, not those that lose, and particularly those that are driven into extinction. Now, as far as I can tell, I'm probably only the third council member to be on the Seattle City Council of Italian descent. So I'm rather partial to celebrating the accomplishments of Italians. But unfortunately, the more I've come to learn about Christopher Columbus, who was born in Genoa, unfortunately, the less enamored I have become of him, and particularly a bit horrified to find out the kinds of activities he engaged in. So what this legislation is about, and what we're about here, is we need to recognize and celebrate something that goes beyond the image of a single conquering hero. I think with this legislation, we have an opportunity to acknowledge the people and the culture that preceded the European culture here, that has also, however, shaped these two continents. And from Argentina to Spain, a number of countries have changed celebrating the landing of Columbus in the Caribbean to a day of respect for cultural diversity, whether it's called the Indigenous Peoples Day or something of that sort. And I think we can begin here in Seattle by doing that. So I see this as only the beginning, but it is a start to changing Columbus Day from promoting what I believe, and I think history has shown to be, a flawed narrative to one that really celebrates life, culture, and ethnic diversity. Thank you.
Bonjour, Nishna, Diami Thomas, Indigenous cause on the Wajin Ojibwe. I'm Clementon Ojibwe, and I'm a former Multnomah Youth Commissioner in 2011. I'm just going to keep this really brief. Growing up, I was never taught the real truth in school. We were taught to praise Columbus for his discovery. I think it's time for people to know the actual truth of what really happened, because something so brutal should never be disguised as heroic. Indigenous people are still here thriving. Indigenous people were here long ago. Indigenous people will be here many years after I'm gone. That's all. Thank you.
Our thanks to the Seattle City Council for a proposed resolution that's long overdue to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Christopher Columbus was not the hero we were taught to believe in while we were in grade school.
As Native people of this land, we really appreciate your alliance, and it's our hope and our wish that we create strong, connected communities together. We find ourselves in these days as neighbors. And it's my hope for my grandchildren that they'll be able to sit with your grandchildren and work out the problems and issues coming to forward. I also share the pain of growing up on the reservation and hearing these stories about these things that happened and not the whole story never being told. And to see this being created as Indigenous Day here in Seattle, what a beautiful thing.
Mr. Collin. I just want to mention that we've got two people who've said that we are changing history. We are not changing history. We can't change history. That's why it's called history. We are changing the name, or what is here is to change the name of a holiday. I think Mr. Riker just mentioned that. I think it's, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of issues around Columbus and what we know about him and what happened back then. The other thing, too, that I think that hasn't been brought up is by celebrating Indigenous people, we also can include the Hawaiian Islands, which we haven't really talked about. I used to live in Hawaii, and I think that's another group of another indigenous culture that we really should respect and honor in our American history. So I think those are important things, and we do need to remember Christopher Columbus and the things that he did, and learn from those. I don't think it's been a long time since anybody has taken Columbus Day off and celebrated what Christopher Columbus did. Banks don't close on Columbus Day anymore. Schools don't close on Columbus Day. It's lost its meaning. I think that was because of a lot of the things that have come about. So I think if we can replace it with something meaningful, I think that's worthwhile.
Yeah, it's a Ethel Branch and being put in Nishle. Nakai Bashas Chin, Sitnajini Dashache, Do Nakai Dashanale. I'm a co-chair for the Human Rights Commission, and I just wanted to first say tremendous thanks to all of you for your incredible leadership and receptivity to this Indigenous Peoples Day resolution. You know, I feel like this moment marks such a departure from history, and you know, we've come a long way since 1492. Human rights were first acknowledged in the 40s with the passage of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And you know, the city has really shown itself committed to human rights. And the consideration of this resolution is a significant step in that direction. So again, I want to thank you, and also just sort of memorialize that the significance of this moment in this resolution and the day when the day is recognized as such is to do an about face. You know, when Columbus came to the New World, as it's called in the history books, he encountered peoples, but he didn't recognize them as peoples. He encountered great nations, tremendous, some of the greatest nations in the world, in our history as a world, but he didn't recognize them as such. And the nations he represented didn't recognize them as such. So I hope that this resolution and the day that's recognized through the resolution will be sort of a reinforcement of the City of Seattle's approach to relations with Indigenous peoples here in the City of Seattle, and also with the Indigenous nations that have always existed here and that continue to exist here. Thank you.
There's, you know, throughout history, there have been changes made, naming places, naming countries, lines redrawn, and so it's, you know, it's called progress. And I really think that this is a great idea.
And honestly, when I think about my daughter who's going to come up here and speak next, I work every day to help her understand how her history, her truth, her moment in life was impacted by 500 years ago, To this day, it is impacting my family in a real and authentic way with mental health issues, diabetes, education struggles. Our kids are being incarcerated at a higher rate and for longer. Our kids are being kicked out of schools at a higher rate and for longer. So when I ask that we as a community start by doing the small things, by changing the words that we use, it's so that our kids can know that when they go to school, there's an Indigenous Peoples Day, that their history that belongs to this country for thousands of years is honored and respected in a way that 500 years can't possibly be that story. We cannot possibly say that that's acceptable. There are thousands of years of histories here, and my daughter and every Native person and every American should be proud of that, and we should be honoring them with those words. So that's why I ask that you support this, and thank you very much.
I am not an Indigenous people, but my son married one. And I'm not Italian, but I married one. I'm here to support Indigenous Day. My ancestors are from Eastern Europe, and we're of Jewish ancestry. So I think I'm uniquely qualified to say that I understand genocide, and I've seen Holocaust, and this is what happened here. The reason I come tonight is because I'm passionate about that the Indigenous people and the lands and their languages are under constant attack. I take the fires in the reservation. They're burning. I take the Dakotas. We got an oil pipeline trying to go through reservations. We've got right here polluted water. I say the Indigenous people are under attack. And I say to stand with them would not really even pay back. It's not retributions, but it would be symbolic, and it would be honoring elders. Maybe not my elders, other people's elders. That's good in my book. Please support this.
I am a Nubiak Eskimo. My Nubiak name is, my Nubiak name is Duck, and I came here today to say that you should vote to change the name of Columbus Day, because one thing that what I've had to deal with was, oh my goodness. With every day waking up and going to school on Columbus Day, or several years ago not going to school during that day, and knowing and reading in the textbooks even that he was the one who found America, and that I was always taught in school that he was a savior, and then I would come home and I wouldn't have learned anything about my own culture that day. Oh my goodness. Knowing who I am is very important, and if you go to school every day and you know that there is a place for you, and there's a day that you know that you belong, and that you feel like you have an identity and you have a voice, and that you have the ability to continue to know your own culture, and you're able to help yourself and understand. So what I really wanted to say was that for Columbus Day, one thing that I would like it to be changed, because I would hope even for my children's sake, when I have children, for them to go to school or anything, just go through life and know that they have a place, and know that there are people out there that the country can celebrate a day where Indigenous people and people that that have gone through so much can have a voice and a place in what they want to communicate. Thank you.
As someone who's got a family that's been in this community for probably over 100 years, as well as a grandson of a first-generation Italian-American, I want to say with all my heart tonight, we do our sincere best to reject the historic racism, displacement, genocide, mistreatment of Indigenous people in our community. So know that to be true, as the mayor stated. Second to that, I really see this as a way to honor the contribution, the invaluable, essential contribution of the Indigenous people of the Puyallup Nation in our community. It really is the fabric underneath our community. We're also here to seek sincerely, I believe, reconciliation and renewal of dialogue, but renewal of action moving forward as we endeavor in this new world together. And as we work together, I know that we all have some really important shared values. All of us who live in this community especially know that we share that our decisions have to be in the best interest of our children and grandchildren. But we share that. We share together. We share a home together. And so I really look forward to us working together with mutual respect for each other and great love for our home, for our community, for our families. So thank you so much for being here.
Sometimes as a people who have been raised as I have in terms of going into a non-native system and being educated and being brought forward into a religion, you lose that part of yourself. And it reminds me of a time when I was young as a 6 or 7-year-old watching TV in our living room, and we were a family of 10 children, and watching John Wayne, of all things, and rooting for John Wayne. And it's like, what twists a child's mind in that way when you don't even know who you are? And the type of thing, what we're asking for today is that history, the truth, be brought to the surface. That's it. The truth come to the surface. Not with a lot of rationalizations on why it should happen, not with the financial backing of how it should be, but the truth be brought to the surface here. And the truth is that Columbus did not discover this land. This land was inhabited by a vital, wonderful people, and then Holocaust began.
I think I would like to say to other people that have been, who are the sons of immigrants, Italians have they have contributed an incredible amount of things to our country. Italians have done so much for our country in so many ways, but when I researched this topic, Italians never, they deserve so much more. You deserve so much more than the figure of Christopher Columbus. Coming from having been to Latin America, you deserve so much more than someone who does not represent, you well. And I don't celebrate the people that I learned about in Indiana that did so many genocidal things. And I'm very proud of that, and I think you can be too. Thank you.
I think that it's a great idea to change the focus of the second Monday of October from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. The more I learn about the way Columbus came to this continent and abused the native people, the more I am grateful that Spokane Council is thinking of us having a day to celebrate and honor Indigenous people. And I think that there's value in switching the name from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm sorry about the Italian American people losing a day that they highly value. But the testimony given tonight shows me that there is a connection between the history of abuse started by Columbus and the challenges of oppression that still face Indigenous peoples in our country and even here in Spokane, state of Washington. So Thank you for bringing this up, and I hope you vote to pass it. Thank you.
But conversation has to start, and I think it has. As our elders said, this goes back a lot farther than your lifetime and ours. I remember being a young kid walking in Daffodil Parade and being told by adults, go back to the blank reservation. Go, that wasn't too long ago. I'm only 44 years old. And so this is a new era between the tribes and the city. As the mayor said, racism is alive. We don't beat racism by avoiding it and ignoring it. We beat it by addressing it and standing on our feet and respecting one another. And I thank you for respecting the Puyallup Nation and all of our ancestors that fought before us, and for respecting my grandchildren that will be here one day. So with that, I raise my hand. Haichkasiam.
I know many schools use the holiday to honor Indigenous people instead of Christopher Columbus, and frankly, it's an accident of history that Columbus is honored this way in the first place. Columbus Day was officially designated as a federal holiday in 1937, despite the fact that Columbus did not discover North America, despite the fact that millions of people were already living in North America upon his arrival in the Americas, and despite the fact that Columbus never stepped foot on the shores of the current United States. Columbus enslaved, colonized, mutilated, and massacred thousands of indigenous people in the Americas. The government of the District of Columbia is clear that we are a government that values equality, diversity, and inclusion, but continuing to observe this holiday runs counter to those values and serves only to perpetuate hate and oppression. Today, I urge my colleagues to vote for this emergency so that we can immediately begin to acknowledge the negative, historic, and continuing impacts of European colonization on the indigenous peoples of the Americas and reaffirm the District of Columbia's commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusion for all. It is my hope that we can come together and honor indigenous people and their rich history and culture today with a yes vote on this emergency. This action is long overdue, and frankly, it's about respecting those individuals who came before us.
And everybody in this town, I look at as family. And I look around, most people that are in this room actually are family. But the thing is I want to make sure that everybody is treated with respect and love that we all deserve. The name Columbus Day, it's synonymous with a lot of hurt and pain and oppression. And I believe as city council, we need to look at what that does to the rest of our family. All these people out here, they are your family. These are the ones you need to be looking out for. And if any group of them are hurting and feeling oppressed, you should stand up for them. Take away what that is that's keeping them oppressed. I know the Italians look at Columbus Day as something that they can look as their day, but the name itself isn't something to look up to and honor. If the Italian people want to have a day, they deserve it. They deserve their day. But we're talking about removing something that was a very black mark in the history of America. And you have the opportunity to do that. You sitting up there right now, you have the opportunity to take away a lot of pain and oppression that has been hurting our people, all of our people, for hundreds of years.
When Columbus got here, he said, wow, look at these people. Look at their physique. Look at their beauty. They would make great slaves. And he took these children from their villages. He took them. He tortured them, and he raped them, and he enslaved my ancestors. And in my heart, this is about getting rid of Columbus Day. Who would want to celebrate a man that tried to wipe out an entire race? We are still here. And that is something to celebrate.
Columbus did not come to discover America. He came to make money. And he came with the idea that he could do this with impunity, with violence. And he did that. And I don't think we should celebrate that. I think we should celebrate the contributions of the people that were here before my ancestors, the Europeans, came to invade. Thank you.
In 1492, on Sunday, October 14th, Columbus wrote in his diary, "With 50 men, all of them could be held in subjection and can be made to do whatever one might wish." And I want to pause to just recognize the resistance and resilience that has proven that no matter what has been done to Native cultures, the resilience that we have seen glimpses of here tonight is stunning to me.
I do support a resolution concerning a proposed Indigenous Peoples Day. It is my belief that the creation of a special day will help foster equality and inclusivity for a portion of our community that has neither. And the date attached to Indigenous Peoples Day allows us to stand and recognize the lasting effects Indigenous people have felt since Columbus landing. It is my hope that we can move forward and celebrate the Indigenous people in our community. I think this is long overdue, and I want to add that my grandfather immigrated here from Italy, and I am confident he would be proud and would support my vote today. Thank you.
We do this for our future, for our children, so that our children continue to understand where they come from and who they are, and the opportunity they have to continue to go to school, to be treated in a manner that is deserving of treating our children as sacred beings. A lot of our work has come to today, and that we celebrate this time of acknowledgement of our people, acknowledgement of a way of life that is not gone, but also acknowledgement of where we're going into the future. Thank you.
For second
Yes,
round.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make note for the record that I am an Italian American. My father is 100% Italian, and I am okay with changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day because I think it is not only symbolic but actually important for us to recognize that but for the actions of Christopher Columbus, perhaps Indigenous people in this country would have been more respected. And as a result of his tactics, we are where we are today. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the concern, and I've gotten the emails from my fellow paisanos, and I respect their opinion, but respectfully hope that my colleagues will join me in doing what we should do here, which is honor the people who were here first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I just wanted to say that having been on the San Francisco Youth Commission for 2 years, Indigenous Peoples Day was something that came up, and fortunately, the first year, our entire youth commission practically unanimously voted to support Indigenous Peoples Day. The second year, we had a bit more diverse views on it, and there was a lot of pushback. And I just wanted to say that after an entire year of going back and forth on it with people who had very differing beliefs, and people who outwardly supported Columbus Day and Columbus, by the end of the year, after hearing talks from Native American groups, talking to our board of supervisors and getting educated on the subject, a lot of those same people were actually the ones who changed their mind and ended up supporting Indigenous Peoples Day. So I just wanted to say that it's never too late to learn, and I fully support Indigenous Peoples Day over any other name, because I think it directly addresses the subject of racial inequity and directly addresses the people that were hurt and damaged historically. So I don't think industrial or other names would be relevant. And I just wanted to say that I really support Indigenous Peoples Day, and I think that even though I do have Italian heritage, I recognize the damages that happened to all of the Indigenous people.
I heard this a lot tonight, and I think it's really poignant because words matter, and our history matters, and what we accept as our history matters. And so when we say that 21st century standards shouldn't apply to somebody, we really do need to look, and Mr. Keith explained this, but I want to read it again because I think it got lost in the beginning. And this is from Eric Cossum, the CEO of the Imagine Institute. Columbus's acts of cruelty were so unspeakable and so legendary, even in his own day, that Governor Francisco de Bobadilla arrested Columbus and his two brothers, slapped them into chains, and shipped them off to Spain to answer for their crimes against the native Arawaks. But the King and Queen of Spain, their treasury filling up with gold, pardoned Columbus. But by the standards of his own day, he was a very, very harsh individual. And yes, we can forgive them, but that does not mean that only one of two national holidays is named for them. That's not forgiveness. It's not erasing them, it's just not honoring them. This is from Columbus's own log. 100 Castellanos are easily obtained for a woman as for a farm, and it's very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 years old are now in demand. This isn't written by somebody else. This is in Columbus's own hand, explaining that 9 and 10-year-old young girls make the best sex slaves for people in Spain. When we don't accept that, and we are taught something else, that is whitewashing history. And in order to heal, we have to accept what the past was for what it was. This is a progression. And now we need to do this, because in order to heal, we need a progression of healing, and those acts have to continue on and on and on. Words matter, history matters, let's vote.
And I was at the ceremony where Canada Island was rededicated and being turned over to the local Spokane tribe for help in renaming it in Salish. And my office worked to bring the Consul General from Canada to this event. And I have to tell you, there was some concerns because some people were very worried here at City Hall that Canada would be offended. That Canada would be offended that we would take away its name that it had had since 1974. It was a council action. And so there were some people very nervous what this Consul General was going to speak about and what would he say, that we were going to take this name away and then have the tribe name it. And he gave the most incredible speech talking about how he had made the trip over to Spokane because it was an honor for him to turn it back to the tribe. It was an honor for him because his country and his prime minister is doing the same thing that we're doing here in America and recognizing our Indigenous tribes and turning their names back to them. So I thought that was an interesting parallel to what we were doing here tonight, that recognizing one race should not discredit another, and recognizing one culture should not take away from the history for the other. So I look forward to working with the recognition of the sister city, with Italy, and my hope is that the Italian people will understand this as well. So I will vote for this tonight.